Good morning and welcome again to the Japan Society's this time third webinar since we returned from our August break. I am Bill Emmott and I have the honor and pleasure of chairing the Japan Society. And I want to thank you all for your continued support for the Japan Society. The inspiration for today's topic comes from a surprising convergence in our two countries' politics and policy agendas. Of course, we are in most ways very different. The UK and Japan have seen very different health outcomes during this year's pandemic, with about 50 times more fatalities proportional to population in the UK than in Japan. As we heard last week, the economic impact of the pandemic on Japan has been roughly half as bad this year as that in the UK, although Japan's rebound next year is forecast to be a lot weaker than the UK's. In foreign affairs, Britain's mind is inevitably dominated by Brexit, while Japan's attention is cast wider towards China, the Korean Peninsula, and, of course, the United States. And nor could any sentient person detect similarities between our two prime ministers, Boris Johnson and the newly installed Yoshihide Suga. Yet there is a convergence in the following senses. Prime Minister Suga was noted when working for Shinzo Abe for the way in which he helped centralize control over the bureaucracy, and he now has set administrative reform, an attack on silo mentalities, and above all, digitalization as a key goal of his new cabinet. Meanwhile, in Britain, Prime Minister Johnson's key minister, Michael Gove, and his key aide, Dominic Cummings, have declared reform of the state and of the civil service to be also a central goal. Partly for that reason, but also thanks to ructions over Brexit, of course, 6 senior civil servants have departed their roles this year, mostly quite abruptly. Moreover, despite our convergence in COVID health outcomes, there has been considerable disquiet in both countries about how well the institutions of government have responded to the medical and economic needs that have arisen, partly matters of communication, but also delivery. All that is why we have assembled two great specialists on government and politics to explain to us what is going on in the UK and Japan on this issue, which parts of it really matter, and where it might lead. So in Britain, I offer a warm welcome to Bronwen Maddox, Director of the Institute for Government, which is the country's top think tank studying the workings of government and how to make it more effective. Before taking up this role in 2016, Bronwen had had a distinguished career in journalism, latterly as editor and CEO of Prospect magazine, before that as foreign editor and US editor of The Times, and initially at the Financial Times. And in Japan, I welcome back our old friend and former President Koji Tsuruoka, who was ambassador to London from 2016 to 2019, and before that, he headed the team negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Back in early April, as you will all remember, Koji spoke at our inaugural Zoom webinar alongside Sir David Warren. As usual, after which we will have a discussion with, most importantly, your questions. Please, as always, submit your questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can vote for other people's questions to promote them. As Japan has a new government, while Britain seems long in the tooth, even though it's hardly really settled into office, it seems right to begin in Japan with Koji Tsuruoka. So over to you, Koji.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you all the viewers who are spending very precious time to be with us your morning and my evening. I'm very happy that I've been invited to speak to you again. I've been given just 10 minutes, I think, and I'll be very brief. The issue here is the new government under Yoshihide Suga, and what are the main themes or targets that he's put up. He's made clear that he is going to reform. So although he has been Chief Cabinet Secretary under Abe for the last almost 8 years, once he is in control as Prime Minister, his emphasis has been on the need to change for the better, and it is more or less using all innovative technological assets to improve the performance of Japanese economy and turn the government more user-friendly. That is, government that can respond more effectively and more quickly to the rising demands of the people. It is no surprise that he's put Japan's response or dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, both in terms of health and also in terms of economy. These are the two challenges that all countries are currently facing. Japan may be doing rather well compared to those that are really having hard times. The latest number of infections in Tokyo for 3 days in a row was less than 100. And this was preceded by a few days or few weeks of between 200 and 100. And now it is in 2 digits. So perhaps it's a good sign, but we don't know. We just had 4 days weekend. And as a result, which was a very well-traveled and popular weekends, because people were becoming a bit comforted that the spread is starting to stop, but we'll see what happens. In any case, Suga, his main theme is to continue on what Abe has done well. But then he put his finger on 2 issues. One is this corona issue. The other is what Suga learned by dealing with the crisis management, that Japan needs to deploy the capacity of using digital technologies. Now, his immediate goal right now, and this is more procedural than substance, is to establish a new ministry that will be in charge of digital issues, digital economy, improving the effectiveness of the digital world. E-commerce will probably come into that as well, which all have been divided into each existing ministry's mandate so far. And the current target date for the operation of that new ministry to start is next autumn. We need a bill to go through the parliament to establish a new department in the government. The bill will be presented to the regular session of the Diet, which starts January next year. And before the end of the Diet, which will be sometime around June, a law will be enacted, and there will be recruitment of officials, appointment of staff, and so forth. And the new ministry will be ongoing come autumn next year. So it's more of a procedural, logistical agenda than anything in substance, but the department will be created to break up the silo in which all traditional ministries have been living. From the Chief Cabinet Secretary's office, which is the controlling tower of the Prime Minister's office in Japan, Suga has learned that there are many issues that go beyond one ministry's mandate or capability. And therefore, combining the various mandates and then commanding that through political leadership is something he's learned as an absolute requirement. If I can just cite one success that this approach has produced, is TPP, which I negotiated. Traditionally, economic trade negotiations were in the mandate of the foreign ministry, which will be representing Japan in coordination with the other ministries, but they are on equal footing, and therefore the foreign ministry will be one of them. TPP wouldn't have been possible if we had taken that model. Therefore, from the very outset of participation, this was seen as Prime Minister's initiative. Much of the logistical demand and procedural a means of engaging has been commanded by the Chief Cabinet Secretary, who does command the Prime Minister's office. So, and I was also working with Minister Amari, who was the minister that appointed by Abe to run that office. And this was the super ministry, and therefore above all the others. There was no possibility silo would protect each ministry's mandate. Now, the open question we have here, no question there are many issues that overlaps or extends to the mandate of the existing ministries. Budgeting, of course, is one, but when you talk about digital economy, telecommunication, it's not just that, data, the security of data, and data, of course, is very varied. Economic, individual, health-related data, these are all very, very sensitive information that most of the ministries that have been in charge of collecting them have been jealously and very carefully keeping them in safe distance. Now, the task has become clearer when the Abe government wanted to distribute 100,000 yen for each individual residing in Japan. It took between a month and two for the cash and this resources to reach the individual that that were designated to receive them. And this was despite all the digitalization that we've been pronouncing, including what's called My Number card. I had my personal experience having obtained my number card in Japan after returning from London. I had applied for a private citizen's passport. My number card, which is the very authentic official identification card with a number of information that's necessary, had no role to play in my passport application. I had to submit all the original data that I've been doing in the very past. It was the second time I asked for a private passport, and surprisingly, I had to submit all the information despite the fact that I had 40 years of diplomatic passports issued because of my job. But now that I'm out of job, I had to submit every detail of my private information. And my number card had no effect. So this is the silo that is typical in many of the Japanese ministries' work. And Suga announced that he will break it up. Kono Taro, the former foreign minister and former defense minister, has been appointed as the destruction person of the silos that are blocking progress. And Suga said, Kono destroys, I build. We'll see what happens.
Well, thank you very much, Koji. As you say, destruction and building are rather different things, and we'll see. And it also, I wonder whether this is, given that Kono Taro is often cited, at least, not least by himself, as a potential rival in the future for Prime Minister Suga, I mean, for the role, at least, of Prime Minister as a successor to Mr. Suga, whether this is a poison chalice or not. We will wait to see, I suppose, whether or not this works out well. We seem to have lost our other speaker from the internet.
Well, Bill, if I may, just another 2 minutes, because you've talked composition of...
You could absolutely take another couple of minutes, or I'll start asking you questions, but please carry on. Could
yeah, and the cabinet appointments, as well as the LDP ranking posting appointments have been quite interesting. The media never applauds anything the government does, and Bill knows this very well. So Suga, despite enjoying a huge popularity, he's only the third most popular prime minister in recent times, according to the poll that was taken just today. NHK announced it. And why? Well, people are expecting Suga to do the work And Suga did manage to have LDP behind him in a very short time period. The appointment of the ranking members reflect the balance that he's making as a political basis that he can operate. So I would think that Suga cabinet will work very closely and well with the LDP. This digital revolution type of initiative has also been directed to LDP as the ruling party's support. And in fact, it is Mr. Amari, my former boss, who will be supporting the government from LDP side. The cabinet appointment is interesting. And Suga won the presidential election overwhelmingly of LDP, but the contenders, Kishida and Ishiba, neither of them were given cabinet posting, nor LDP ranking positions. Now, those second in line, who's been rumored to be running for LDP presidency, Taro Kono, Motegi Toshimitsu, they are continuing to be in the cabinet. So is Shinjiro Koizumi. So these are the younger generation. There are about 10 to 12 years difference, in the case of Koizumi even more, between Suga and those that I've named. And they have been kept in the cabinet. And this indicates that he will use them. He will encourage them to do their most with the carrot hanging on their nose. If they don't do well, there's another one who will become a potential candidate for the next prime ministership. And that is another way Suga is trying to deploy all resources possible.
Well, thank you for that explanation about the politics behind the cabinet. I can see that we've had a resumed digital revolution in Bronwen's streets, that she's back online for us. So I'm not going to waste the opportunity. I'm going to go straight to Bronwen, just in case British internet fails us again.
It's actually British electricity power cut.
Right.
But I'm back, more dramatic. Very good to be with you. And so apologies, I caught only part of the previous remarks, but can, I hope, follow straight on. Well, let me start with what the new government in the UK is doing about civil service reform. And very unusually, after it won this big election majority in December, and all kinds of plans started coming out about what it might do, one of its main advisors, Dominic Cummings, spent really quite a bit of Christmas talking about reform of the civil service. And this, while this is very interesting for the institutes that I run, it was surprising in that this is not something that sets the streets on fire, if you like. It is not something that the public are rushing around demanding is changed about the UK at the moment. But it's been there in his mind and in the mind of senior people around Boris Johnson, I think for a long time, since some of them were running government departments, particularly the Department of Education, and finding all sorts of frustrations there. And so the government has come in and it's done several things. One, in a sense, the most dramatic, is that it has merged the Foreign Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, with the Department for International Development. And there are questions about whether the Department for International Trade is going to survive as a standalone. And there is a big military and strategic review going on at the moment about Britain's policy there. And the aim of all of these things, the government is saying, is to try to give Britain, or global Britain, as it wants to call it, a single face to the world, a coordinated foreign policy, so that, for example, the aid department isn't doing one thing, but foreign policy is doing another, and trade doing a third thing, and so on. And there's both enormous opposition to this, quite a lot of cultural opposition, particularly around the former aid department. But there is also some sympathy, I think, in that the government really does want Britain to speak with one voice, and Britain is going to have to be much clearer in some of the things that it's saying internationally as it comes it's already out of the EU, but as the transition period with the EU ends. So there's a whole thrust of changes surrounding that, and various civil servants have gone because of that. But then there's the more technical, bureaucratic mission, if you like, in which the government is bringing a lot of passion. And that is things like strengthening the centre of government. That means the Cabinet Office, number 10 Downing Street itself, the Treasury, making them work very closely together, strengthening the people in them, increasing the technical skills of civil servants, particularly in things like economics, finance, risk analysis, to try to improve the quality of the judgments that they're making in policies. Relocating some of them outside London. This is part of this government's mission to level up, as it's called, to try and share the benefits of prosperity across the whole country. And so there is a very technocratic reform mission there. And then you put on top of all of that, not just the mechanics of Brexit, which are inflammatory enough, but coronavirus and the enormous strains that that has brought. And all these pressures have ramped up. And so while this is part of the government's plan, even before coronavirus appeared, the difficulty that the government has had in addressing coronavirus, and particularly getting some of the nationwide parts of the response working, like the testing program, that has, I think, increased its frustration and increased its desire to push through these reforms. And we've seen some very high-profile exits of civil servants, including the cabinet secretary, because of that. And that's a bit of the why also that the government is doing this. It does predate coronavirus. In a sense, it predates Brexit, but is very closely part of that. It's the government trying to find people who will get things done. Now, I don't think that this is the same thing as politicizing the civil service, the famously impartial civil service that the UK has. I think it is about trying to get people who can get this done. The government has been suspicious that some civil servants were very skeptical of Brexit. They retort that, look, we do what the government asks, and we've done all kinds of things. And there's truth on both sides. I think some of the exits of civil servants have been justified, and others less so. But so we have this program now, and broadly, while there's been a lot of questions in Parliament, there hasn't been opposition, I think, to this change of the civil service in itself. You're beginning to see some of the weaknesses of it, though, as well as some of the possibilities. Some of the weaknesses are that the government doesn't have a close grip on local government. It's cut itself off in a way from local government by this extreme centralisation. And Britain is already a very centralised country in its government. And yet to get something like testing for coronavirus working, you need to work closely with local government. It is extraordinarily hard to do that without close cooperation with them. And we come to Bill, your question about what does this do to foreign policy and to Britain's face to the world, if you like. Well, as I said, the thrust of this should make that face more coherent. But in practice, some of these extreme changes in the civil service happening at a time of a lot of change in British foreign policy is adding to its own strains. So we've got a lot of the civil service working on both the Brexit deal and the potential for no deal. And then there's a whole phalanx of them working on coronavirus as well. And I think the effect of all that is just because of the constraint on capacity, is that it's going to take more time than the government would have liked for any of these projects to come through to fruition. I think I could stop there. There's all kinds of things we could discuss indeed about Britain's foreign policy and where that might go, and the US election coming at us not very far away. But in terms of the what's going on in civil service reform, the why, and a bit about the effect that this has internationally, let me leave it there for the moment.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And I'm obviously particularly reassured that you directed us not to believe that this is a process of politicization, but rather reorganization with a goal of effectiveness in mind, rather parallel to what Koji was telling us in Tokyo. I'm going to follow up quickly with a question about central versus local, because I think that's very important, and perhaps Koji might follow. Every sort of cycle of if you like, transformative change in Britain, at least that I remember in my lifetime, perhaps really beginning with Margaret Thatcher, has begun with a general call that local government needs to be more important, and then a radical centralization that in fact makes local government less important. This, as you say, has been particularly expressed, or at least the difficulty with it has been seen through the coronavirus and our comparison with Germany and others who have a stronger local thing. Do you think that local government will be part of this process later? Are there lessons capable of being learned in this process, or is it a remorselessly political instinct to centralize in this way?
I think it is a political instinct. You get many governments before they're elected talking about decentralization, about devolution of power and money. And it is amazing how often, once they're elected, they find it very tempting to hold on to the power and the money. And this government is not alone in that. And this crisis, I think, has increased its incentive to do that, because they feel, meeting in a kind of war room every day, that is the best way to keep control of it. I think it is the testing regime, though, and just how difficult that is. I mean, local hospitals have actually done rather well in sorting themselves out, and the hospital trusts, and working out now how to specialize so that some take coronavirus patients and others are completely clear of those. But to get the number of tests out and then back and tested, and the results back to people as quickly, this is it was never going to be easy. There is a real question about whether it's almost too difficult for any country on the kind of scale that you would need to get people who might be exposed to the virus back into work, back into school, or whatever. But I don't see a way of doing it without significant local help. Whether they will pursue that generally, they might. There is a suggestion that they will look at creating more combined authorities, mayors of regions, if you like, cities and the regions around them. And these have proved rather successful in organizing parts of Britain. So as well as the devolved nations, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, actually getting parts of England to run themselves better. That has been gently moving forward. But it's a hard thing for government to organize. And then the fact is, once you give power or money away, you don't have it. And that comes as quite a wrench. May I pick up as well on your previous point about the politicization? I think it's not the intention of what the government's doing with the civil service. And I don't think it will be the result. But one thing the government is doing, I didn't mention, which is bringing in a lot of political advisors, special advisors, as they're called, and keeping quite close control of those as well. And that does add a different dynamic. There's a strong case for doing that. People, politicians don't have very long to do what it is they're trying to do, and quite reasonably want people who believe in that project. But the danger is that it cuts them off from the civil service, who can tell them in detail how you're going to get something done, or that it isn't possible. Thank you.
Now, Koji, Martin Barrow was actually asked exactly the question I was going to lob in your direction in Japan, because it's a parallel question about central versus local, when you've got a very centralizing force, and indeed a welcome, as Martin has put it, pleased to see the focus on elimination of silo mentality, tatewari gyosei, across ministries in Tokyo. He asks, will this be extended to links with local governments across the country, particularly in the COVID environment? Teamwork in engagement, collaboration is critical, and also working closely with governments across the region in East Asia. Well, that's taking it into another dimension. But Koji, how does this centralization and the elimination of silos then feed into the relation with prefectural and local governments and the Tokyo metropolitan government, in your view?
First of all, we should start by recognizing the difference of UK and Japan when it comes to providing or giving the local governments having power to rule themselves. The Japanese constitution, which was a gift from the Americans during the occupation years, is a mix of traditional parliamentary democracy and the American presidential system, as well as the American federal system. The governors, the 47 of those in Japan, are direct local constituency. The government during the Meiji period was the central government appointing those governors, and therefore interlink between central policy and localities were assured. Nowadays, that's no longer the case. The police are also independent in each prefecture, although appointments are doing double, so the heads of the prefectural police is also a national employee. So there are these same issues that you're facing, the central versus the local. But in the case of Japan, the tendency before the war was central being the superpower, commanding everything that happens in local governments. And because of the new constitution, it's a bit twisted. And democracy, of course, gives more power to the people in the localities. One very clear example is, although the Japanese nuclear reactors, many of them that we have been certified after 2 to 3 years test that they are totally safe. For them to start refunctioning, they need to have the governor's approval. And the governor, because they are directly elected by the people and the term may be 4 years, they always measure how the people would react if the governor gives green light to restart of the nuclear reactor. And of course, the majority would not like that. So he's not going to take the risk of offending his constituency, and therefore almost no reactor has been reactivated in Japan. This is very bad for climate change. Safety-wise, the very strict standard that has been put up after Fukushima has been cleared by many of the reactors, but even those that have been certified as safe, because of political reason, are not reactivated. So this is the kind of mandate and task the governors have kept to themselves, and it's not like the central government giving them the ability to do so. At the same time, health, of course, is an issue that is universal. So the COVID case this time with the local authorities, the gubernatorial setting. There's been regular, if not everyday, contact between the central government and the local government through the webinars that have been ongoing. Nishimura, who continues to be the minister in charge of Corona, has had a series of webinars, some of them even broadcasted through the television to the public, with all the governors in Japan. And paradoxically, because we are now conducting this through the web, all governors can attend. You don't have to do the travel, and you don't have to break appointments to do that. So the sharing of information, when you have ministers speaking, beforehand, the bureaucracy will be sharing lots of documents and policy papers to prepare the governors for their participation. And that has made the coordination rather well. Having said that, there are resources questioned. And then Tokyo, of course, is the richest of all. So Tokyo could have done better. And the coordination continues to be a task. Now, the silo question, whether breaking up the silo will affect how the central government, local government relationship operates, it's a good question. And that probably is going to be an issue that will be more task over a long run. for the very immediate future of breaking up a silo that prevent efficiency and effective government functioning, we'll be focusing more on the new technologies. And this is Martin quite right in pointing out that it's going to be an issue, because unless you dig into the real basic cause why there are differences that needs to be overcome, the operation could not be as functional as expected after you take away the silos, because the mentality continues to be there. Resource will not be distributed according to the policy very easily, because we'll have the inertia will go on. And this happens all over the world. Japanese people are very conservative, and they will stick to their precedents, which also is a point Suga made in his initial press interview. Bad precedents should not be respected. Now, of course, who judges which precedent is bad is another question. And therefore, this is going to be an ongoing process. But I can say that there is an awareness on the part of both the central government and the governors that coordinating with the central government when it comes to issues that is nationwide and universal is a must. And there's no excuse for not doing it now.
Thank you. Now let's focus for a moment on the on foreign affairs. And Bronwen, of course, spoke about the merger of the Foreign Commonwealth Office with Department for International Development. You, Koji, spoke about the way in which TPP was organized in a sort of super ministry type way, so that you had a common face. May I ask you, just to kick off a discussion about the DFID FCO merger by offering your observations as a diplomat. Do you think does it, in your experience, make organizational sense to put together aid and foreign affairs and perhaps in the future trade, as Bronwen said, and then we might see Bronwen's reactions and also speak a bit further about this.
Well, I believe it makes a lot of sense. The industrialized democracies, either through OECD or UNDP or through bilateral consultation, have always tried to coordinate aid policies. Now, UK has been a very difficult government to do that, because anything that is policy related was seen as politicization of aid. Whereas aid by definition is politics. And you have to have a rationale which the people support, because it's taxpayers' money that you'll be spending. And that policy has to be debated. And if you want to be effective, it has to be coordinated with like-minded countries. In the case of UK, the budgeting is fantastic. 0.7% of GNP has been constantly met by the UK government, even during the period of, or even today when the budget is tight. And this is something that the world needs to commend. At the same time, the implementors, the implementation of the aid is in the hands of the multilateral agencies, UN agencies, the NGOs, and perhaps some coordination, which it hasn't come up yet in your debate, the crown agents. So when Japan has a bilateral regular, which hasn't been taken place for a while now, aid coordination meeting with UK, and we were doing this with DFID, and then sometimes crown agents. And you have a two extreme. DFID originally was humanitarian and would not be discussing policies, would not be addressing reconstruction or building up the country's economy. It was more down to earth, and the implementors were NGOs. And the British NGOs with British nationality would operate in the developing world through their office that is in the capital, and they will hire local people to go into the villages and do the work. And this is not a model that can be coordinated very effectively, either with UN or Japan, because Japan has two means. It's loans, which is for infrastructure construction, and grant aid, which goes directly to health-related humanitarian causes or dealing with refugees and so forth. So all of the Japanese aid, and we had at one time in the 1980s, the largest aid budget of the world. And that has now come down to about half of it. The Japanese economy downsizing is also one cause of that. But we've always kept in our mind how you effectively deploy taxpayers' money, which will serve Japanese national interest. Fortunately, Japanese national interest in the minds of the Japanese people is almost equal to international interest, because if the world is in trouble, Japan will not be able to survive. So we need to explain that, but it has not been an impediment of promoting Japanese aid, not politicizing that, but with a direction. If I may just add to that, what is the philosophy or what is the goal that we're trying to do is to promote what we call human security. Put value in the individual. If you enable the individual to operate effectively in the community or in the nation or the government or institutions, then they will be able to stand on their foot and then be able to carry on building up their own country. It's not just feeding them. You need to give them the means of how they could feed themselves. So these are the project finding, the prioritization of where you spend the money and resources, that if you have the policy perspective, the policy coordination will result in identifying which projects we can work on. We have been trying to identify through the Free and Open Indo-Pacific initiative that Abe has announced, certain projects alongside a sea lane, where we could coordinate with the UK experience and expertise with the Japanese willingness to participate. Africa is another major target for that coordination because of the long history UK has had in dealing with the African from the colonial days. But the policy orientation was not necessarily there if the issue was left only in the hands of DFID. I had requested, while I was ambassador, meeting with the DFID secretary constantly, and never was able to meet her. I was wondering why. Perhaps DFID did not have a foreign affairs, foreign policy mindset that required to allocate time to meet a Japanese ambassador in London. Hopefully, with the DFID being merged into FCO, you will have more policy people deploying the resources that are very precious and could be very effective and useful if combined and coordinated with other like-minded countries. It is already being coordinated with the UN to a certain extent, but that coordination can even be improved because UK resources is very viable. And the Japanese presence is also quite effective. And these adds means of conducting a more creative diplomacy to UK government. So I welcome that. The international trade part is similarly important to be seen more in terms of policy orientation. It is not just giving British companies opportunities to do better business abroad. It is creating the image of UK globally, and it is also a policy that is going to assure a more prosperous, free trading world. And the International Trade Minister Department needs to promote that, and that will have to be very politically supported by the leadership. And it is a choice. There are countries that have USTR, for example, is not part of the State Department in US. They conduct themselves differently. It's a silo in a way. But if you are a superpower, you can afford. If
Mhm.
you are a middle power, you have shortage of credibility, power, and resources. The more coordinated, more efficient use of resources will be the best you can do. And coordinating with like-minded countries like Japan and UK is going to be extremely useful. So I would welcome this integrated approach of looking at the different means. It's not that the silos cannot do the work, but it could be even more effective by having policy on top of that.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Bronwen, I mean, following on from that, and I wonder if you could give us some more thoughts about where you think this is heading, this integration, or the creation of another super ministry, if you like, in the UK. It always used to be said that the Treasury was too powerful. Will we in future have as a cliche that the Foreign Ministry is now the other superpower in British government? But Stephen Gomersall, the former British ambassador in Japan, and now with Hitachi here in the UK, has asked a question about this, saying, what do you think is the long-term agenda of this reform of ministries? What is it a means to do in foreign affairs and the economy? What do you think this is? A vision has emerged beyond some slogans like Global Britain?
Well, no, this is fascinating, and I thought Koji's remarks were really fascinating from that perspective of someone trying to deal with the old DFID, the Department for International Development. As much as anything, I think the budgets had got, between the Foreign Office and the Development Ministry, had got out of kilter in a way that was not foreseen when the Department for International Development was created. And because of the 0.7% commitment, which Britain really had stuck to, that budget for development was heading up to about 14 or 15 billion pounds, whereas the Foreign Office budget, which had been pared back and back and back, was sliding below 2 billion. And it seems to be getting really very difficult for the Foreign Office to operate as an intelligent, modern set of diplomats in the world, in all the countries that the UK was going to want to represent itself, particularly with the complexities of leaving the EU. So at the very start, while there's a lot of people rushing around saying, no, look, we're not going to chip into the 0.7%, but we might look to redeploy it. I think that the budget was a problem, and that the imbalance between those two. The merger, I have some sympathy in principle, very much as Koji was describing, to try to unite these two things. But it is anathema, and has been anathema in British politics, part of British politics, and in parts of Whitehall, to say that, because of the feeling that in the past, when those two things were merged, that development aid had become really just a tool of foreign policy. And the mission of the Department for International Development was poverty reduction. It was not to advance trade deals. It was not particularly to try to put pressure on regimes that Britain thought ought to be behaving differently. It was to try to improve the lots of some of the poorest people on the planet. And the fear of people who don't like the merger is that will be lost, as it will become that large amount of money will really be deployed in the service of Britain's national interests, trade, strategy, all kinds of things. And I think there's something on both sides. But as Koji was describing, aid policy with as brief, with as big a mission as poverty reduction, however big the budget, can go off in some directions that actually could be contrary to what the host country wants. And I think it was a very large sum of money. And I think that department, while it had got enormously better since its creation, it had struggled to show that the money was always being well spent. That's a great bugbear of development. It's very hard to show impact, very hard to show what difference you've made. Inevitably, there are going to be some cases on the ground that don't go so well. It was having to deploy quite a bit of that money through other agencies, whether through the World Bank or through the EU or so on. It wasn't able to disperse it all itself. So I think there really were questions about where that was going to go, and the sums were just going up and up. And what you really want is the best of both. You want some of those aims. You want a review of the aims of Britain's development policy, but not for all of that to be thrown out the window and just made put in the service of, for example, striking trade deals. And we'll really know more in the next 6 months. A great deal of work has been done on trying to bring these two departments together. The cultures are very, very different. The Foreign Office is very much one of diplomats and people who go out to learn about the country that they are living in or analysing and reporting that back to headquarters in Whitehall. And the Development Ministry was very much full of people who would very likely do that for their whole lives, whether in Whitehall or in an NGO or something. They saw themselves as development people. They don't see themselves as Whitehall warriors, as the phrase goes. So I think there are real practical problems about merging those together, but I don't think the principle is crazy. It just depends where the government takes it. In answer to Stephen Gomersal's question, has a vision emerged yet? No, but that doesn't mean there's no vision, the government doesn't know what it's doing. It's said enough things. We want a united face to the world, and we want these things to work more closely together. And I think those are reasonable strategic goals, and we'll have to see in detail where that comes out. I mean, the big questions about Britain's foreign policy at the moment are not that, it seems to me. It's about, first, the Brexit deal or no deal, and what really is going to happen about that. And then about there's some questions about trade deals and where all that goes. And then there is really, if you wanted to put the finger and say, well, here, what is the thinking? Is there a big gap here? I think there is a huge debate, even within the government, about military policy. Is Britain going to be a military power that does anything on its own? Is it always going to work with allies from now on? And if so, which allies? Does it have big things like aircraft carriers, or lots of invisible things like cyber tech? And how big is its army? And you've got people leaving the army now, or maybe a few years ago, who joined an army that was close to 250,000, and now we've got it sliding below, 80,000 down into the 70s. People talking about a smaller one. So there are, if you want to put a giant red question mark over a bit of Britain's foreign policy, to me, it's very much over the military bit, and I'm looking forward to the answers from the strategic review this autumn. I'm sure they'll come.
I'm sure they will. And do you think, just back on the DFID FCO thing, would your judgment now, and it's an unfair question about, be that this will become a bipartisan conclusion? Or given that...
How do you mean, Bill?
What I mean is, if Labour come in 4 years' time, will they just reverse it because DFID was essentially a kind of Tony Blair sort of toy, and then you go back? So is this ping pong between the parties, or is this, do you see this as reflecting a long-term consensus?
It's not a consensus. So Labour would not do this, and all kinds of former Conservatives, the high-profile ones, including David Cameron, have queued up to say they wouldn't have done it either, and they're opposed to it. So it's a minority view to this. Would Labour reverse it? I'd be surprised, because going back to a conversation on centralisation, it does give more control of the money and the foreign policy. Money is very, very tight. Responding to one of your points in the middle there, nothing is going to topple the Treasury's primacy at this point. In an era of no money, the Treasury is king. Labour might, though, influence the culture of that combined organisation, and might try explicitly to protect, if you like, the mission, the development mission. It might spend some time on putting words to that, but I'd be surprised if it did unpick them. One of the things we say at the Institute to any government coming in is really be careful about forming new departments or taking them apart. It takes ages. It really does, and can distract your energy. Every time a government proposes it, reminds me of an old New Yorker cartoon where the husband says to the wife, "Darling, we can either pack to go to the country or we can go to the countryside, but we can't do both." And the sheer administration and organization of trying to get these departments to work. People have got to move office, desk, not an easy thing at the moment. New lines of reporting have to be set up, new projects, new sense of direction. It really can burn up years and millions of pounds. And so I think anyone would be well advised not to unpick it, but just try to work with what is there and fashion that to their ends.
Koji, on sort of a slightly parallel question, I mean, one obviously long-term characteristic of Japanese government has been consistency of party in government, but not consistency of prime ministers, typically. Before Prime Minister Abe, we had 6 prime ministers in 6 years. Before Prime Minister Koizumi, we had similar turnaround, if not quite as fast, during the 1990s. So a natural question that people are asking and sending in, Paul Diamond and others, and Philip Howard, should we see the Suga administration as expecting to be a long-term one, and does that affect?
Of course,
autumn next year.
It's a very good question. All political commentators are asking that question, and it's linked with whether Suga will call a general election sooner than later, or will he refrain from doing that till time runs out for the term of the lower house member. So what I would be saying is just personal. Very surprised if Suga will be happy to step down once the term of Abe's presidency ends, which is next September 2021. That'll be too modest a target for a politician who's finally made it to prime ministership. But of course, it will depend on how much support he'll be able to collect and gather and make it basis for his political leadership that may continue on. Now, at least I believe the targets that he's put up, for example, this creation of the digital ministry, which is supposed to start operating sometime in the autumn of next year, is a target that he will have to implement, not just setting up the department as a building. It has to be substantiated with policies and all the results that could affect the performance of the Japanese economy nationwide. So just looking at those objectives and tasks that he's put up, he is putting on long-term objectives and tasks that he wants to implement. So I'd be very surprised if he will happily retire and then leave it to some other politician to continue on. So having said that, the issue is whether the party and the public is prepared to do that. I think it's been a fairly surprising phenomena that his popularity has risen so high. His name was not mentioned if you go back 1 year and then talk about who could be succeeding Abe. Very few would say Suga. And he was the sort of the last resort when not everybody else fails. But now he is the leading, and then he is the popular prime minister. So it's most likely that he will continue on, and then by calling a general election and winning it, it will be just simply legitimate democratic after being elected president of LDP on his new term, because serving this term till next year, he's just serving Abe's remaining term, but he will have to do his own term. And then what Japan will do, and this is what I believe we need to look closely on what Suga will be conducting. He is not going to be patient. He has to deliver one after the other. And everybody will be expecting the talk about reform, talk about being citizen friendly or the government serving people better is going to be tested against how much he's delivered. And this is going to be, if not months by months, a weekly test of what did you accomplish. So this is going to have a very strong effect on the working ethics of, or working mode of the bureaucracy, as well as the LDP parliamentarians, because they will not be able to continue deliberating and perfecting ideas until everybody agrees that nobody's objecting, because that will be losing time. And you should not underestimate the strong will and leadership that Suga will exhibit. He's done that. Kato, the new chief cabinet secretary replacing Suga, is a former, originally, finance minister official and very capable. He's famous of being very capable. I've known him also, worked with him, and he's quite capable. And he also takes very strong directives from the Prime Minister, Suga. So you will have to watch what are the initiatives that he will be taking on. One incident is for foreign policy issues. Suga is no expert on that. He admits it, but he says it's not that he doesn't know. Fortunately, on the foreign policy side, there's no major initiative that Japan needs to take on right now. The US presidential election, we'll have to see how it comes, and the importance of having US-Japan alliance strengthened. Nobody would disagree. We may have another president, but no US president will destroy our bilateral relationship in any case. And we are working with the like-minded democratic industrialized nations, which will continue on. So there's no huge challenge right now, although the Chinese challenge, North Korea, security issues with Russia and so forth, continues to be with us there for the last few years, if not a decade. So this is going to be an issue of continuity, and the Suga's handling of diplomacy will be more conservative and going on in terms of continuity, which is not going to give him great points politically from the Japanese people, but nobody's expecting Suga to be a star in the international community right away. So in a way, he's inherited the situation that he can fill in very well. And with the experience of having run the government the last close to 8 years, he has identified issues that he feels could deliver active results that will serve people's interests better.
Thank you to both. We've run to the end of our time, but it's been a very fascinating discussion. And thank you to Koji for giving us that final perspective about the prospects for the Suga administration, how to think of it in international affairs. We do have the American presidential elections, how to avoid remembering that. We have the issues about Brexit that we've been admirably restrained at trying to discuss today. I would say one thing, small observation, just from an excellent article I thought in this morning's Financial Times about the search for a coronavirus vaccine, which I think that there's a chart in that article about the Financial Times of which countries have pre-ordered the largest number of doses of vaccine per head of population and the number of different types of vaccine. And in that chart, Britain is top. Britain has, by quite a clear margin, were done the biggest job in trying to plan ahead for buying doses of vaccine, and yet we've been among the worst at running a test and tracing mechanism, which I think somewhat illustrates that we can work out how to spend a big sum of money in an effective way or a decisive way, but not so good at implementing on a national and local basis. So I recommend that we all think harder about that. But most of all, I want to thank Bronwen Maddox from the Institute for Government, Koji Tsuruoka, our old friend and former president of the Japan Society, for spending their time with us, for explaining this complicated issue so clearly, and thank you all as members of the Japan Society and an audience for being on the call. Next week we will have very much a media orientation with John Simpson of the BBC and Aiko Doden of NHK, looking at the ways in which our public broadcasters and our media in general treat foreign affairs. So I hope you might come back for that.
Bill,
yes.
I'd like the viewers to listen to this. I applaud Bill's leadership in convening. This is very. Corona should not prevent us from continuing to discuss intellectually and develop ourselves what issues we need to address. Thank you. Thank you, Bill, and congratulations.
Thank you, Koji, and thank you also to Bronwen. And
thank you for having me. Very good to be here.
Great pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.